A very good morning to you all and welcome to this very important event, panel discussion about tobacco harm reduction. And what really truly matters for thousands and thousands of EU citizens when it comes to combat cigarettes. I'm genuinely happy that you're here and hope to host this event where we can share information with independent consumers advocates that will tell their story, how they escape the harms from smoking. My name is Johan Nissinen. I'm a member of the European Parliament. I was before a member of the Swedish Parliament as well. And I'm a member in the Committee of Public Health, Sant. And there I took the seat there because I think it's very important to talk about harm reduction and legalization of snus on the single market in Europe. I have never been a smoker myself, but I have seen family and friends try to quit smoking, and I know it's a very hard situation, and we need to have different ways to stop smoking. And I also strongly believe in the availability to have different kinds of ways in different kinds of countries, because every country have their problems with tobacco and they have their solution and traditions. So coming from Sweden, where it's only 5.6% smokers of the population and much lower than the EU countries, it's very easy to see the link between the numbers of smoking and also the alternative as snus, nicotine pouches, and vapes. The Swedish government, with support of my party, the Sweden Democrats, have recently taken another step towards its smoke-free target by reducing the tax on snus with 20% and increasing the tax on cigarettes and smoking tobacco by 9%. And I would say it's safe to say that Sweden don't only have the theory of harm reduction, we actually have harm reduction right now in the legislation. Unfortunately, the European Commission is doing totally the opposite. For instance, 2021, nicotine pouches was presented as a legal loophole, statement that was both misleading and incorrect, though making unfair assumption that did not take into consideration the opinions of member states, the European Parliament, and the experts given on the subject. A year later, EU documents revealed the European Commission exaggerated claims about the member states' desire for EU-wide regulation and called to ban tobacco-free nicotine pouches. The Commission based its claims on an informal survey. The Commission based the thing was that it was only performed in 9 member states, with nicotine pouches legally available as consumer products in only 6. So the European Commission used an unfair and misleading argument for further restrictions on nicotine pouches. So, the main focus should be harm reduction. If it is decided to, some country want to put taxes on it, it should be risk-based, not just an overall tax for everybody. Once again, thank you for the participation today, discussion. And I will now give the floor to Mr. Clive Bates from the UK. Mr. Bates had a diverse career in the public, private, and non-profit sectors. He started out with the IT company IBM, then switched career to work in the environment movement. From 1997 to 2003, he was Director of Action on Smoking and Health in UK, campaigning to reduce the harm caused by tobacco. In 2003, he joined Prime Minister Blair's strategy unit as a civil servant and worked in senior roles in the public sector and for the United Nations in Sudan. Mr. Bates is now Director of Counterfactual, a consulting and advocacy practice focused on a pragmatic approach to sustainability and public health. I give you the floor, Mr. Bates.
Johan, it's a real pleasure to be here, and also you feel, as a British person, you feel a little regret that we're no longer part of the European Parliament, European institutions. Anyway, if we could move on. I'll just signal like this, okay? Okay. Just to say that I don't have conflicts of interest. I've been in this game for quite a long time. I've been a convert to the cause of harm reduction since about 1998. So for the last 25 years, I've been pushing this agenda. We should always start with the basic problem, which is the problem is essentially smoking. Each year, smoking worldwide kills around 8,700,000 in the EU. That's more than these other main causes of death and disease, and actually about equivalent to COVID-19 every year. The excess mortality from COVID in 2020 and 21 was about 8 million per year. Okay, so we've got on our hands something that roughly affects the same demographic and roughly the same sort of magnitude. The response to it has been much less. At the heart of the problem is combustion. Okay, this is the burning of tobacco leaf at the tip of a cigarette, creating thousands of new chemicals at high temperatures, around 800 degrees. Over 7,000 chemicals, 70 of which are well known as characterized as carcinogens. The level of smoking in the EU is still very high. There's around 70 million Europeans who smoke daily. This is Eurostat data. The prevalence is actually higher if you take all smoking, including occasional, into account. There's around 3/4 of them have been smoking for more than 10 years. So this isn't a youth issue. This is Europeans who've been putting themselves at risk for many, many years. It's a deeply entrenched habit for most of the people who smoke daily. We should also just note on this chart the position of Sweden at the top there, with by far the lowest and an anomalously low rate of smoking, and we're going to come back to that. The key issue is that people smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. And that what this means is that people are dying, getting disease from the inhalation of that toxic smoke formed in combustion processes. But the reason that they're doing it is to consume nicotine. Nicotine is the recreational stimulant that people are trying to get, and smoke is the way of delivering it to the lungs. And this insight is at the center of tobacco harm reduction, because if you can take nicotine in an acceptable way that doesn't involve smoke, you remove almost all of the disease risk. Okay, there are now a range of products that enable us to do that. Vaping products, heated tobacco products, pouches and oral nicotine, and much more long-standing is the smokeless tobacco products. The characteristics of these is that they all deliver nicotine in a way that's acceptable for consumers, but does not involve combustion, and at very, very much lower risk to the user. Okay, and in that set of 4 broad categories, we have the secret to undoing the epidemic of disease and death caused by smoking. Kills 700,000 Europeans every year. Okay, now I want to say there are 3 conditions for harm reduction to work. The first is that there must be much safer products. The second, that these products must displace smoking and not add to it. And then the third is that people want to use them. It's no good having perfectly safe products that no one wants to use. Okay, they just sit on the shelf or nobody makes them. Okay, so people have to want them, and that's a crucial thing, as we'll see in the consumer model of tobacco harm reduction. So I'm just going to go through the evidence for those 3 very briefly. 1, safer products. Most of the evidence for this comes from exposure biomarkers. So this is measurements of toxicants in the blood, the saliva, and the urine. And what you find is that with vaping products and all the smoke-free products, the levels of toxicants are much, much lower. usually the same as, close to or the same as in non-smokers, and about the same as in background. Now, there are some that are elevated. You sometimes see studies where they're much toxicant profiling studies, but they're often done in situations that are unrealistic for users, where the products are overheated and so on. But when you measure the toxicants in the blood, saliva, and urine, they are very, very much lower. And that gives us confidence that they will impose a much lower burden of disease. Not necessarily totally safe, but much safer. Now, this data, you can't go through it all today, has been assessed in a number of authoritative studies. This one by the Royal College of Physicians essentially concluded that the risks of vaping are unlikely to exceed 5% of those associated with tobacco products, and may be substantially lower than this figure. That's the Royal College of Physicians. Next. This is a massive American study, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. They are likely to be far less harmful. Next. A huge assessment done last year by the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities in the UK. Vaping poses only a small fraction of the risks of smoking. Okay, now that has looked at everything. The cancer charity in the UK has come in and said that e-cigarettes are far safer than smoking, and it's also drawn attention to the fact that there's an economic benefit here, that the costs of smoking versus vaping are much lower. Now, given that smoking is concentrated in poorer populations in the European Union, this is an important benefit to the household budget for people who continue to smoke, and has a range of knock-on benefits in terms of health and well-being associated with diet, housing, and quality of life. So the economic benefits have knock-on benefits. Okay. Many people will know the story about snus, and there's a proof of concept that we should pay attention to here. There we go. That's more or less the same chart that I showed earlier. It's a slightly different basis and slightly earlier. Again, we see very low levels of snus use, but it also leads to very low levels of disease. And you can see Sweden there has anomalously low levels of tobacco-related disease and premature death. This is premature death associated with tobacco. This is from the Global Burden of Disease study. And you can see Sweden is an outlier in both, and that's not a coincidence. It's an outlier because people use snus in Sweden and don't smoke to anything like the same extent. It's also, Europe wants to beat cancer. Well, it's also a way of beating cancer. And again, I'm going to highlight Sweden. Okay, so this is lung cancer mortality, and the curve for Sweden is at the bottom there. Next, all cancer mortality. So that's taking in all cancers caused by anything. So the difference in lung cancer and smoking-related cancers are very significant. Sweden is substantially lower. A lot of people will say, well, are you just swapping lung cancer for oral cancer? Well, Sweden is lower in oral cancer than all the other main EU states. So these charts have shown Poland, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. So just took the largest EU member states, and for which there's data. And again, you can see a massive impact on cancer. So Europe beating cancer, you could do better, you could hardly do better than making snus legal and allowing people to use it. But snus is proof of concept for all of those other forms of non-combustible alternatives to smoking. Right, so smoking, not tobacco, smoking is the central issue. And it's a disappointment to me that when Europe called its plan the tobacco-free generation rather than the smoke-free generation, because tobacco in some forms, like in snus or heated tobacco, can be the solution to smoking. All right, displaces smoking. Let's go. This is a very experienced group of US academics. They believe that these alternative nicotine delivery systems have the potential to disrupt the 120-year dominance of the cigarette. This is the Cochrane Library, which summarizes all the randomized controlled trials. And they found evidence that e-cigarettes with nicotine increase quit rates compared to NRT, and it's high certainty. There's also a range of evidence. This is summarized by the British smoking cessation expert, Robert West, Professor Robert West. Evidence from randomized controlled trials, from observational studies, and from population trends all triangulates in a way that suggests that e-cigarettes are bearing down on smoking. I just want a couple of examples. We've seen incredible results in New Zealand. The orange line is at the top is Maori smoking, and the blue line is Maori vaping. Now, one of the most marginalized populations in the world there, seeing huge gains through vaping, a 1/3 fall in 3 years. This is heated tobacco products in Japan. Cigarettes and cigarillo sales, this is sales volume, have fallen by 50% in 10 years. And the reason? Heated tobacco, almost certainly, and that's backed up by academic data which suggests that these two things are not coincidental. Closer to home, some fascinating information from Norway. And here you can see that smoking amongst age 16 to 24-year-old women fell from 17% to 1% in 10 years, an amazing change. And when you look at the pace of change by age, you can see that enormous changes and rapid changes are possible. Okay, but what has also happened is that there's been an increase in snus use in that group over the same period. And essentially, young Norwegian women have swapped smoking for snus, and that will have been with enormous benefits to their health. The green line is the combined snus and smoking rate, and that has trended slightly downwards. Okay, so I just want to say, with the right incentives and the right framework, the right regulation, tax, communications, messaging from health professionals, people can and will switch from the high risk to the low risk products with great benefits to themselves from their health and well-being and financial perspective, and at the population level. This has been embraced by the National Health Service in the UK, and they have a simple message to the public. Vaping is far less harmful than cigarettes and can help you quit for good. Now, if only we could get simple messages like that from the health organisations, from the European Commission, from the European institutions, I think that would be enormously beneficial. Next. And then we also now in the UK have this new scheme, Swap to Stop, which is the government funding a starter intervention aimed at the poorest smokers in society to try to get them started on vaping with a free starter kit. And that is proving very successful. It's beginning to roll out now. And this is an attempt to get people diverted from their track of smoking, which leads to illness and death, onto a track of vaping, which they will ultimately pay for, that will improve their health, well-being, and financial circumstances. Okay, the third element, consumers must want it. And this is really important. And I think we have to try and distinguish here between a medical versus consumer model. Now, this is the medical model. And this is the way smoking cessation generally works. It's a controlling intervention. You are a patient, you have a substance use disorder, we will treat you for withdrawal and you will become abstinent. Okay, that's the traditional pharmaceutical medical approach to this way. But this is a completely different way. Okay, and that often leads to relapse. Okay, and that's why these methods are not very successful. Okay, now a completely different way. Okay, is you think of a consumer undertaking recreational nicotine use. They switch to an alternative which is available in a marketplace using their own initiative, their own money to protect their own health, and they become smoke-free. They don't become abstinent, they become smoke-free, so they deal with the main problematic issue, which is smoking. And at the end of that process, they're still a consumer, but they're a consumer at much, much lower risk. And I think this is really interesting because it brings us into the core business of the of the European Union, which is the operation of the internal market with a high level of health protection. So this is going on in the marketplace, and the EU has massive competence here. And I have to say, so far, with the exception of the snus ban, it's not done too badly. The question is whether it will continue to do reasonably well compared to, say, the United States or Australia, which are disasters, or whether it will revert to excessive regulation and prohibitions. Okay, but this is an area where the market works, where people's consumer choice will drive out the cigarette trade, creative destruction through consumer preferences and consumers doing the right thing for themselves. That's it. So at the heart of it, there's a choice. Do people use the more dangerous or the less dangerous product? And I think we have to think of nicotine when it doesn't have the smoke as another form of socially acceptable psychoactive substance. You know, there are 70 million smokers, maybe 80 million tobacco users in total in the European Union. They're doing things a little bit like consuming caffeine, light alcohol consumption, and increasingly cannabinoid consumption. Okay, and if we get that into our minds, then we can think differently about how we regulate these products, rather than seeing them as a massive driver of ill health. They're an alternative to ill health. Okay, next. Okay, just the reasons why people smoke. There are psychoactive effects that people like. A lot of people are in denial about this, but there are. And let's just go to the next one. Okay, so broadly, I break these down into three main areas: pleasure, functional, and therapeutic. We won't go into them all, but basically people like the feel of it, the feel of the dopamine release, the sensory effects, and the ritual and social aspects of it. On the functional side, for some people, it provides cognitive advantages, improves memory and so on, controls stress and anxiety, and for some people it's important as weight control. And then there are a bunch of therapeutic benefits from nicotine that where people may be self-medicating, not taking prescriptions or medicines with nicotine, but just self-medicating. So those are some of the reasons why people use it, and we cannot imagine those away. It's much easier to quit smoking without quitting nicotine, because nicotine is the thing people want. Now, with that insight, we should be realizing that it's easier to get people to switch than it is to quit. And that's why the randomized controlled trials show that vaping and other smoke-free products are more successful than full smoking cessation with medications and NRT and so on. To actually be appealing and actually be used, these products have to deliver nicotine in a way that people find satisfactory. And this is a chart of the speed of nicotine delivery into the brain, the peak and the time after beginning to smoke, okay? The top line is cigarettes, and they deliver the most nicotine the fastest. That's still the case. The other lines are other forms of smoke-free products, okay? Now, I'm just pointing out here that if you can't match cigarettes in nicotine delivery, then people who smoke will not use the products. They won't find them satisfactory. So if you start to put constraints on nicotine delivery, like the 20 milligram limit, that kind of thing, you're compromising the ability of the smoke-free products to compete with the smoked products. The next thing is to realize that people have to get pleasure from this. This is what we call a flavor wheel, and it has, hundreds potentially of flavors. There are, several thousand flavors available in the European Union. People like the flavors. They like the flavors from cigarettes, but those are caused by the burning chemicals from the tobacco smoke. For vaping and other smoke-free products, you have to add the flavors because they don't naturally necessarily taste of anything. So the flavors are integral to the experience, and in particular, the diversity of flavors. And when you look at who uses flavor, this is American data, but it'll be very similar in Europe. You'll find that fruit, dessert, pastry, chocolates, and sweets flavors are the most popular. Okay, and people want to get away from the tobacco sensation and into something different, often quite frivolous. But these are all adults. These aren't kids. Next. Okay, So I just want to emphasize, we'll get a public health harm reduction effect when there is reduced risk and also when the products are attractive and people are willing to switch. It's down to people's preferences in a competitive market. Okay, so harm reduction works through consumer preferences and leads to the creative destruction of the cigarette trade through the internal market of the EU and the member states. It's a market-based phenomenon. It is not a healthcare system or treatment or clinical intervention. It's a market-based phenomenon. Okay, and I am going to, at that point, hand over to our consumer groups to provide testimony on their experience of this market and the regulations that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Pate, for a very interesting introduction here. Very good. We learned a lot. Yeah, and I hope the EU can also learn from this, actually. And the next speaker is Julio Juárez Esteban from Spain.
Buenos días.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank MEP Nissen for organising this event, because we're really listened to by the authorities in order to get an understanding of how we are quitting smoking. Regulations like TPD3 or BECA will affect the health of millions of people, and we believe that our experience is key in order to really get as much sex along the way. My name is Julio Juárez, and I'm a spokesperson for ANESVAP, which represents 600,000 Spanish vapers. And my goal today is that for the first time, you'll learn about the experiences of real people who, having tried everything, actually managed to quit smoking thanks to vaping. They recovered their health and their lives. And this is a fight for our right to make informed decisions about our own health and taking accountability for ourselves as well. Because single-handedly we've found a solution to smoking, and we believe that no one should stop us from doing this. After 10 years, we've seen that the authorities have misperceptions about vaping and the huge potential it has to change people's lives. And this influences regulations that will affect our health and our lives. And those of us who are directly affected by this are rarely listened to. That's why we created this book, which includes 1,500 testimonials, where vapers freely talk about their experience. And it's an unprecedented tool that demonstrates the public health potential of vaping and how misguided regulation can destroy it. So I'd like to share one of the testimonies in this book, which is actually mine. I am a former smoker and a veteran vapor. 13 years ago, one Friday at midday, I received my first e-cigarette, and I remember it very well because that day changed my life. I started using it, and to my surprise, I didn't smoke a cigarette in the entire afternoon. The next day, while I was watching a football match, I lit a cigarette, and that was my last one. And I still keep that packet of cigarettes, which has those 12 cigarettes left. They're like little hostages. I remember a time when I couldn't live without them, and I would smoke over 20 a day. I would get up, and the first thing I do would be look for my cigarettes and lighter while I was coughing and coughing. And 13 years later, I can see really clearly that tobacco was killing me. But that dependence was greater than my ability to reason, and I couldn't quit. So the e-cigarette has really changed my life. That coughing, chest pains, constant fatigue, all of that's gone, and I feel better than ever. My food now tastes like something again. I can lead an active life without feeling defeated on the floor. Why should we deprive other smokers of this? Why condemn them to the threat of lung cancer every time they light up a cigarette? We have a living testimony to the lives that this product can save. So let's now address the reason that has brought us here. With TPD3, regulations are about to be implemented in Europe that can cause great concern. To begin with, European vapers see one of the key factors that allowed us to quit smoking under threat, so flavours. So let's listen to Geordie's testimony now. I smoked compulsively for 40 years, over 40 cigarettes a day, and it's obviously had side effects for me: gum disease, COPD, and 2 heart attacks. And it said on the tobacco packets that this caused impotence. And I laughed about that, but it's actually true. And doctors said that I had to stop smoking, and because I was aware of the fact that it was ruining my life. But I continued to smoke, and I went as far as saying that I would die with a cigarette in my mouth, and I wanted to be buried with a packet of cigarettes in my coffin. And then by chance one day I smoked an electronic cigarettes, and I've never gone back to regular cigarettes. I've discovered flavours as well, and tobacco flavoured liquids, actually, I find them disgusting. And my body has improved. My family no longer suffers from passive smoker. I'll never smoke again, but I will take those 5 litres of e-liquid to my grave. And it says, we're told that flavours attract children in order to justify their banning. But I think adults also like these pleasant flavours as well. Why don't people put themselves in our shoes and imagine what it would be like to continue to have to smoke or be smoke-free, but have to use a flavour that you're not really keen on. Vapers stay away from tobacco because for the first time, quitting smoking is becoming a pleasurable experience, precisely because of those flavours and nicotine. We don't consider ourselves sick, and so we have to take medicine to quit smoking. We don't need anyone to talk down to us. The key is pleasure, and the flavours aren't really a whim, they're a cornerstone to quitting smoking. If legislators destroy the pleasure of smokers, then millions will continue to smoke cigarettes, and a massive unchecked black market will flourish across Europe. So we need to think carefully about youth, because it's a mistake to assume that banning flavours will stop young people from vaping or smoking. Prohibition works as a way to attract young people, and banning flavours from vaping will actually lead a lot of people to smoking. On the other hand, it's argued that online sales should be banned in order to prevent access by minors, and this is something that we're also very concerned about. Safer nicotine products have to compete in the market with tobacco, and users have to get their liquids and vapes on a regular basis. This wouldn't be a problem if vape shops were found, just like tobacco, on the corner of every streets in our cities. However, in countries like Spain, there are very few shops, and they're actually clustered together in big cities. If online sales were banned, hundreds of thousands of vapers would have to travel tens or even hundreds of kilometers to get what they need. So now I'm going to read Jose's testimony. My name is Jose, and I live on the small Canary island of El Hierro, more than 1,500 kilometers from the mainland. Due to an accident, I lost a lot of mobility because my spinal cord was affected, and since then my health has radically changed for the worst. I needed to stop smoking by any means possible, so I tried everything, and I was not successful. And one day I found vaping on the internet. On the island of El Hierro, there's not a single vaping shop, but thanks to the online advice from users and professionals, I managed to buy my first vaping device online, and I quit smoking on the spot, and now I'm a happy ex-smoker. Despite my condition, I did experience improvements in my cardiovascular and lung health, which allows me to actually do high-intensity exercise while having good muscle tone, despite being in a wheelchair for most of the time. If online sales were banned, then I'd have to face the madness of having to take a flight in order to get the products that keep me off tobacco. And I'm really afraid of going back to smoking, as the quickest way to get nicotine would be just to walk into the bar opposite my house. So imagine for a moment what going back to smoking would do to someone like me. So online sales have literally saved my life. If the online sale of vaping is banned, while tobacco continues to be everywhere, thousands of people will go back to smoking and they'll die. Now let's talk about another unknown but essential aspect of vaping. Vapers need to educate themselves in order to quit smoking. There's lots of misinformation spread by tobacco control groups, which are indiscriminately spread throughout the media, defining vaping as a dark activity by the smoking industry to generate a generation of addicted children, and this is false. It was the users who, by joining together in online forums, developed the initial device to make it really effective for quitting smoking, which is why there are a variety of devices now, because one vape system doesn't fit all, and each user has to find the one that best suits their needs in order to stay away from tobacco. So now let's listen to one story. I'm 61 years old. I smoked a lot for over 40 years. And one early morning, I had a heart attack. My heart actually tripled in size so that it no longer fit in my rib cage. And in intensive care, I had a critical episode and I was injected with morphine so that I would die without suffering. But I actually managed to overcome this trance-like state, and I woke up a few days later, and when I had the ultrasound, I was told that the size of my heart was actually incompatible with life, that I should actually be dead. My response was that, I'm sorry to tell you this, doctor, but I am here right now. And as the months went by, I was on the verge of going back to smoking. But just then, vaping came into my life. And in a specialised shop, they actually advised me and they informed me about it. I actually learned more about it from the internet and YouTube channels, and I've never gone back to smoking again. And after a few days, I noticed the positive effects of vaping. My health, even though it was quite bad, it started to improve, and I can actually walk 6 kilometres now without stopping and while speaking at the same time. My lung capacity is 70% and my heart capacity is 73%, and when I left the hospital it was 21%. So I can guarantee that if I had gone back to smoking, I would not be writing this testimonial today. Vaping saves lives, and I am living proof of that. Every time a smoker starts vaping, they look for information on the internet. They need to educate themselves, and at that crucial moment of change in their lives, they find a community of thousands of users, professionals and reviewers who help them and accompany them on that journey, teaching them everything they need to know. Vape forums and channels act as real advice centres for dealing with smoking. And I think this is essential and needs to be maintained. I myself lead one of the biggest vaping channels in Spain, and I can assure you that the message I receive the most is thank you, because I quit smoking thanks to you, and that is priceless. So from ANISVAP, we're very hopeful that European authorities come to understand that the regulations of these products, not just vaping, but of other tools that are historically successful like snus, require care and dedication. It's not just about a vague ban or equating them with tobacco. You can't regulate a product that saves lives in the same way as a product that kills people. Regulations have to be debated in a transparent way in the Parliament that represents everyone. And this should also include child protection without sacrificing or undermining the health and lives of millions of adult citizens. But above all, please listen to your citizens, because we are a living testimony that harm reduction by smoking can be an excellent contribution to public health regulations. But also, with time and dedication, it could be the key to ending the biggest cause of preventable death in Europe and the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julio, for your statement. It was very interesting, and it's good to hear good examples, like people who have the fight against the smoke, so it's very good. And I hope the people listen actually take this in. And the next speaker is Philippe Poisson from France. Welcome.
Okay. Bonjour, je vais m'exprimer.
Good morning. I'll be speaking French. I'd like to thank you for coming to this presentation, and I'd like to thank Johan for holding the event. My name is Philippe Poisson. I'm 52. I'm French. I'm currently Vice President of the SOVAP Association, and that helps to reduce the risks linked to smoking in France. We're a member of ETHRA. I have no financial interests or affiliations with tobacco, vaping, pharmaceutical or financial industries. Next slide. So sorry, you can go on another slide. One more slide. Thank you. I had health problems at one point. Back one slide, please. I wasn't looking at the slide, sorry. We had a bit of a syncing problem there. I had health problems which meant I wanted to give up smoking after about 28 years of heavy smoking. And wanting to quit smoking is something that over 2/3 of smokers want to do. This is what we found in the Förra survey in 2020 with over 37,000 EU respondents. Carrying on smoking isn't to do with a lack of willpower from smokers. That's the important thing. It's hard to stop smoking. I tried the normal endorsed methods such as patches, gum, medication, and other non-endorsed methods such as hypnosis and so on, and it was all a failure. It's very hard to accept psychologically, particularly given that I ended up with other health problems too. Next slide. In 2014, I tried vaping, and I haven't smoked since. I'm not the only one like that. In our survey, there were, amongst the 31,000 vape users, 84% quit smoking. Amongst the 1,000 snus users, 74% stopped smoking. And if you look at snus users in Sweden, the 85% had given up smoking for quite obvious reasons to do with the social climate of the more favourable position regarding using snus as opposed to the rest of the EU. To be so successful, harm reduction tools must have the right characteristics that respond to consumers' needs. The environment has to be right for smokers to give them a try and adopt them. Amongst those important characteristics, the number one on the next slide is nicotine. That's quite surprising. We had a study group with Save Up in France, and most of them were scared of nicotine. Unfortunately, people aren't scared enough of the toxic substances in the cigarette. They are scared of what would have allowed them to stop smoking, and often they underdose either with vapes or pharmaceutical nicotine substitutes. That's what we've seen. I won't go into that anymore, but if the nicotine limit in Europe was put up, around 30% of vapers who haven't yet been able to give up smoking say they will be able to give up with a greater nicotine amount. Another very important point in terms of characteristics to do with risk reduction is on the next slide. If you're a smoker, you're bombarded with a very shaming discourse. You're bad, you're a sinner. So there's a Judeo Christian message to do with making you a scapegoat. You're going to suffer if you give up smoking. It's all counterproductive. 96% of smokers that try and give up without help fail. If you compare that to the 84% of vapers who stop smoking that we've seen in our survey, but if you seek pleasure, then that allows you to stop smoking and to give up on the long term, and that's why vaping has several advantages. And flavours are essential here. Almost 10 out of, or nearly 9 out of 10 vapers don't use tobacco flavours. Most of them as Clive showed earlier, use fruit flavours or others. And I like the confectionery flavours. The diversity of devices is important too. I've got a small vape device. I don't live in Brussels, so I've got a light vaping pen. I have had heavy ones previously, and that helps me to adapt to my needs throughout the day and the week. And the different devices are good for different types of consumers, which is important. Diversity of flavours and devices. Next slide. Price. That's also a considerable point. When I stopped smoking in 2014, I was in a difficult financial situation because of my health problems. At the time, there wasn't a surtax on vaping, so it was cheaper than smoking, and that gave me an extra motivation. With all the reasons, including health, there was also spending a bit less money on it. That was a reason. That was a considerable reason. 65% of European respondents said that gave them an extra incentive, the fact that vaping is cheaper than smoking. That's important given that smoking is a real social issue, and smoking levels are higher amongst lower income levels, and it's harder for low-income people to give up than higher-income people, and take some more attempts. So there's an issue of social health justice here. So it's quite clear. If you want smokers to stop smoking, if you want to get to being smoke-free by 2040, then a lot of the current smokers are going to need to stop. And for that to happen, they need to have risk reduction devices to stop smoking. And price is a real access issue to do with physical access, as Julio was saying. On the next slide. You can see the harm caused by doubt and misinformation. When I was stopping smoking, I was split. Part of me was saying you can stop smoking, the other part said grab a cigarette. That was difficult. I was very ambivalent, and there's a lot of doubt. So each time I had a new concern, there was a new concern in the media about vaping, I was very stressed, on high alert, and it made it harder to carry on. In our self-help group for stopping smoking with SOVAP, every time there's bad news, it's often fake news, there are lots of people that start smoking again. Now, on this slide, I've got two screenshots. One is the cover from the ASH guide on fake news on vaping, ASH UK. The other one is the homepage from the New Zealand Health Ministry. It's a vaping info page. I didn't find one single site in the EU giving that information, not an official site, and that's quite worrying. However, looking at the next slide, if you carry on, if you resist these doubts in the media, then you'll see after weeks and months that your health improves. And for me, sorry, but I had a lot of brown phlegm. I'm sorry to be so explicit, but in the morning, and that all stopped as months went on, and I breathe much more easily. I don't keel over from, but I shouldn't spend too much time sitting down. But I'm not the only person to have seen that. 97% of vapers, of 30,000 vapers that responded to our survey, said that the risk reduction and the improvement to health were why they started vaping and carried on. So 3% are excluded from that, but I think it's extremely significant that effectiveness of reducing the harm when you stop smoking with those means. It's quite striking that there's that you don't hear about it. It's more outside user circles. And just to conclude, I've got 4 ideas on the last slide. I've given you a brief view of my journey away from tobacco with our 2020 survey from ETHRA. And you can see the survey on ETHRA's site. EU User Nicotine Survey, it's called. You can see that in French or English. And I'll give the floor to Tom in a moment. But I haven't gone across all the different cases because each case is unique. But there are broad brushstrokes. So if I was to give a recipe to help people, to smokers to get out of smoking, to reduce, you need a good amount of nicotine in the products. You need to have a pleasurable product. That's essential. Flavors are essential for vaping on that score. You need access to these products. That might go without saying, but you need to be able to financially and physically access these products. And then you need objective, honest information on this. It's quite unbelievable that smokers can't make an informed choice because there isn't enough information from EU countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for this. Great information. Very good to hear that your story and all the good facts. Now I will give the word to Thomas Clisson from Ireland.
Good morning. I'm an advocate with the New Nicotine Alliance Ireland. We represent nicotine consumers, specifically consumers of safer products such as e-cigarettes, but we also represent the rights of consumers of combustible products to access these products and to get correct information about them. I was someone who smoked close to 30 cigarettes a day for 35 years. I enjoyed every cigarette, I can tell you that. But I was resigned to the fact that I would smoke for all my life. The recommended, proven, safe and effective products didn't work for me. In 2011, I first came across electronic cigarettes. At the time, like everybody else, I was skeptical. But the novelty attracted me, and out of curiosity, I bought one. It was a cigarette-like device with a blue light where the red flame should be. The day after purchasing that first e-cigarette, I had stopped smoking. That's 131,500 cigarettes I haven't smoked since then. So what was different about e-cigarettes, which in essence are just another nicotine delivery? Why did they work for me when gums and patches had already failed? I'll admit it probably was, they answered the question of what to do with your hands. They provided nicotine, and when you got bored of one flavour, you had a range of others. You could tailor the experience to fit what you needed to stay away from cigarettes. The evidence says Support and counselling are crucial to a successful quit attempt. When I switched to vaping, I met other people on the same journey. We supported each other, and the shop I brought the supplies in gave me the encouragement and advice to stay the course. Most stop smoking services are under-resourced. In Ireland, we have 9 We Can Quit facilitators, supplemented by clinics, a hotline, and there's probably a smartphone app. But we also have over 300 specialist vape shops. That's a resource that's being ignored, and that opportunity to reach and support many more smokers is lost. When I first switched to e-cigarettes, they were largely unregulated. But that changed in 2014 with the EU TPD. Now they're regulated as a subcategory of tobacco products. The TPD, thanks to the input of consumers, turned out to be quite helpful. It's far from perfect, but it regulated the components and the liquids used in them for the protection of the consumer. It didn't impose the taxes and the restrictions that were already on combustible products. This reassurance led to smokers embracing these new products. As you can see, we had a dramatic fall in smoking prevalence. These are Healthy Ireland figures, and they show the decline in smoking rates from 2015 to 2019 as e-cigarettes replaced smoking. So what happened in 2019? What caused that stall? Next slide. We had a flurry of misinformation, mainly driven by the Avali incidents in the US. The CDC refused to correct this misinformation, even though they knew the outbreak was caused by illicit THC products. And the misinformation impacted e-cigarette uptake. It led to a stalling in declines in smoking. Vaping prevalence fell from 5% to 3%. And smoking went up another 1%, where it has stalled at 18% for the last 3 years. Consumers are directly affected by regulation in the expected ways, but also in unexpected ways, unintended, but not unforeseeable. There's a real danger that measures intended to reduce e-cigarette use will have a negative consequence and protect the cigarette trade. The two products are interchangeable, and anything that reduces the market advantage of one will increase the market advantage of the other. As much as we wish that the tobacco industry would bear the brunt of regulation, the fact is that burden is borne primarily by the consumers of the regulated product. After the TPD, we had to struggle with 10 ml bottles, generating huge levels of plastic waste. We had to accept a 20 milligram nicotine limit, which for heavy smokers is a barrier to them completely replacing combustible cigarettes. And now we're seeing proposals to ban flavours and restrictions on device options. This will be an imposition on consumers who have exercised their right to choose a reduced risk product, and it will reduce the appeal of e-cigarettes. That, of course, is the stated intention. But it risks the unintended but foreseeable consequence of smokers continuing to smoke, and some vapers going back to smoking, especially the ones who had not fully switched. Will it stop non-smokers from using e-cigarettes? Well, that's doubtful, as most use in this demographic is experimental and occasional. But it is possible and even probable that this type of restriction will increase the number of people who experiment with smoking first. While no one wants non-smokers to take up vaping, we have to ask, can we be certain that any proportion of these people won't end up smoking if we go too far in discouraging e-cigarette use? When we talk about the health cost of tobacco use, what we're referring to is the health cost of smoking. If we forget that and instead get distracted by reducing nicotine use, we'll end up doing more harm than good. If that shift in focus delays an inevitable decline in smoking. As we can see, negative messages about e-cigarettes can end up being perceived by the general public as positive messages about smoking. Those things are worse than cigarettes. I might as well keep smoking. is a phrase I've heard all too often and a damning indictment of public health messaging. Since the Royal College of Physicians first published its report linking lung cancer to smoking in 1962, tobacco control measures have reduced smoking from a 55% prevalence down to around 20%. But this decline has not been universal. Smoking has largely disappeared among the better educated and better off demographic. The same policies that reduce smoking for them has not worked for those at social disadvantage. That's understandable. When today's demands are all too pressing, quitting smoking becomes a problem for tomorrow. But there is one exception. Sweden is now on track to be the world's first smoke-free country. Its current prevalence is under 6%. They will achieve that smoke-free target 17 years ahead of schedule. Sweden has the same tobacco control policies as the rest of Europe. Yes, they have achieved what the rest of us are failing to do. What they have in addition to regulation is a gateway out of smoking. The availability of snus, a smokeless product. The stick of restrictions and taxes is accompanied by a carrot. Further punitive measures will not reach people for whom the cost imposition of tobacco taxes is already disproportionate. And there's a huge opportunity to reach this demographic with reduced harm products. We missed the opportunity of snus, and are we going to miss this second chance to replace smoking with smoke-free products? Health inequalities will be reduced through measures that have a greater effect on smokers in higher prevalence groups. That focus must be targeted on reducing smoking, which is the most significant cause of premature death. As Clive said, nearly 700,000 deaths every year in the EU. This is what will bring the greatest benefits to public health. If there's one message to take away by regulators today, it's that while combustible cigarettes remain available, either legally or illegally, the far less harmful range of reduced risk nicotine products must be more available, more affordable, and importantly, more attractive to consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this. It's very interesting as well. It's good to hear. And I will give the word back to Mr. Bates.
Okay, thank you. I'll use this one. Okay, so in this one, we're going to talk about more of the policy issues involved in this and where things can go right or wrong. So if we could just, hello? You just advance. So policy considerations are the theme for this presentation. Next, please. All right. First of all, Europe is already very highly involved in this. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that everybody's signed up to, and that's to reduce non-communicable diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, COPD, respiratory illnesses by 1/3 by 2030. Okay, it's a very, very challenging goal, but the focus is on disease. Second, we have Europe's Beating Cancer Plan. Again, the focus on reducing cancer, and also Europe's Healthier Together programme, which is for the non-communicable diseases other than cancer. Okay, so there's a real European Union interest in this, but its focus is on disease. Okay, and that's the thing to bear in mind. Next, please. Okay. The two European programmes have established a goal, less than 5% of adults using tobacco by 2040, compared to around 25% now, and an interim goal of reaching 20% tobacco prevalence by 2025. Okay, the EU has instruments to do this. Next. Okay, the Tobacco Excise Directive on taxation. Next. The Advertising Directive, the Tobacco Products Directive, and also a Council recommendation on smoke-free environments. The important thing is that all of these are up for discussion. They're already under discussion, but in the next Parliament, these things will all come to a head, and it will be a major part of the Parliament and the Commission and Council's activity after the election, my opinion. Okay, so this is a good time to be talking about this, but I'm sure it won't be the last time. These instruments have actually served us reasonably well so far. I mean, they're not perfect. It's not the optimum regulatory arrangement, but they are not the disaster area that we have in like the United States or Australia, where they've gone far too restrictive. So far, the market is working reasonably well as intended. People can put these products on the market, not snus, obviously, put these products on the market. People can buy them and use them. There's reasonable information and warnings and so on. Not ideal, a lot wrong with it, but it's not that bad, okay? The question is it about to get much worse, or could we even make it better? Okay, next. So my main message in this presentation is that the science of policy making in this field is all about unintended consequences and trade-offs, because you're dealing with much safer products compared to the market dominant product, which is much more dangerous. So it's quite easy for regulation to make things worse rather than better, as it has done with the snus ban. Okay, so a very good expression of this was from the Royal College of Physicians report. Again, I mentioned this earlier. Okay, that's the text. I've broken that down into a more readable format. Hello? Yeah. Okay, so a risk-averse and precautionary approach makes e-cigarettes, there's a list here, next, less easily accessible, less palatable or acceptable, i.e. less pleasurable, more expensive, less consumer-friendly, pharmacologically less effective, i.e. the nicotine, or it inhibits innovation, then it causes harm by perpetuating smoking. It's the most insightful paragraph that I think I've seen in any Royal College of Physicians report, and it basically warns policymakers that it's perfectly possible to make things worse by intervening in a well-intentioned way to try and make things better. You can actually make things worse. Next. Okay, 3 types of unintended consequences, I would argue. First, adverse behavior change. So you think you're going to get people to stop using pouches or stop using snus or stop using disposables, but what they do is something you don't want them to do, which is relapse to smoking or take up cannabis vaping. Second type, workarounds. So people say, well, I can no longer buy this in the shop, but never mind, I will find a way of doing it myself. So I will mix the flavors that I want myself at home in my sink, or I will buy them from some other guy who mixes them, or in the case of small containers, which Tom mentioned, we will use so-called short fills, which only exist as a way around EU regulation, where you add high-strength nicotine to a product and then top it up. Okay, and then finally, illicit trade, and there are multiple forms of this, and it's surprisingly prevalent. It's not a trivial issue, as some would argue, or a tobacco industry argument. The tobacco industry do make the argument, but it doesn't stop it being an argument because it is quite serious. We have criminal enterprise, cross-border purchasing. With illicit trade, you tend to get younger people involved in the supply side as well as consumers. So you make things even worse than they would be with poorly regulated legal trade. So again, I want to emphasize the policy making in this field is the art of navigating trade-offs and unintended consequences. I'm going to give 5 rapid examples of where this can go wrong. First of all, we've already talked about the ban on entire product categories. The poster child of that is the snus ban. The origins of this, not everyone knows this, but if we don't learn the lessons of history, we are condemned to repeat them. This emerged in the 1980s when a snus-like product, Skull Bandits, was introduced into the UK. It created a moral panic about youth use of these products, even though, as you can see, they were marketed to adults. And the UK banned them completely in 1989. The UK then used its influence within the European Union to ensure that these products were banned in 1992 in EU directives, and they have been banned ever since. Okay. Now, the problem is, of course, We have had 30 years of Sweden and Norway, which is outside the EU, benefiting from these products, 3 decades of European Union citizens not benefiting from these products. And you think about what could have happened if we'd seen the kind of changes we've seen in Sweden and Norway in the countries of the EU. And there is data, I'm not showing it here because there's no time, that shows that Finland, when it joined the EU, slowed down its rate of decrease in smoking because snus became illegal in Finland, and therefore there were unintended consequences. But I think in the UK, if we'd had snus for 30 years, we'd be in a very different position than the one we're in now. Next. Okay. And I think we may be about to repeat the error of the snus ban because we're not learning from history. We're starting to see EU member states ban pouches, including here in Belgium, where they have banned nicotine pouches on the basis of basically a fabricated moral panic about youth pouch use. These are products for adults, and they would be much better if they were regulated by the EU, by the member states, than if they were banned. Next. Banning flavours, okay? We've seen moves to do this, for example, in the Netherlands, where they have tried to restrict flavours down to just a few tobacco-related flavours. This is a terrible policy. Next. Next. So when you ban flavours, the intended outcome is that young people will become abstinent from nicotine, vaping, smoking, and any other vice. They will do something else instead. They will do more homework, they will play the piano, they will play football with their friends or whatever, okay? But that's not the only possible reaction to a ban. And I'm going to put down a list of the reactions now, okay? And we're not going to go through all these, but if you just assume that people will become abstinent, you're making a massive mistake. People can go back to smoking, they can vape the legal products, they can mix their own, they can buy aromatherapies and so on, okay? So moving on, what actually happened in a case where flavours were banned? In San Francisco, they were banned. This is youth smoking. Okay, youth smoking went up in San Francisco compared to districts where they hadn't banned flavours. Now, you would think people would learn from that you ban flavours. It's exactly as everyone says, people go back to smoking, including young people. Teenage smoking increased following an e-cigarette flavour ban in San Francisco. Now, everybody needs to understand that. Next. Now, that research by a great American researcher, Abigail Friedman, also looked at all the flavour bans in the United States and found, as you would expect, a big trade-off between reduced use of e-cigarettes and increased smoking. 15 additional cigarettes were smoked for every 1 less 0.7 millilitres of e-cigarette liquid pods sold, okay? So they found a gigantic trade-off in all the jurisdictions in which flavours had banned, including in the cigarette products that were most popular with youth, okay? Again, no one is learning these lessons from actual econometric studies done in the United States. Next. Okay, banning the advertising of vapes. Everyone says, oh, advertising's a terrible thing. Okay, next. Okay, but these advertisements function as advertisements against smoking. They are advertisements to smokers to quit smoking. There is advertisements to vapers to stay off cigarettes, okay? Because they're promoting a safer alternative to cigarettes, they are pro-health advertisements. So when you ban them, you have to be very careful that you're not doing something anti-health. Next. And there have been some studies on this in the United States, again, by economists that show that e-cigarette advertising of some types actually, when you ban it, causes cigarette smoking to increase because you are no longer advertising an entrant product that is good for health against an incumbent product that is bad for health. And that's an important function of advertising. Next. what you should do is regulate and control advertising themes. And these are the themes, this is how advertising is controlled in the UK. You set standards and principles about the themes and placement of advertising so that it avoids youth themes, but allows responsible advertising so that consumers know what's available. Next. Warnings. This is the fourth category. So in the Tobacco Products Directive, vaping products have to carry this warning here. This product contains nicotine, which is a highly addictive substance. That is a gross oversimplification of what nicotine is, but let's look at what it does to people's perceptions. These are reasons people give for not trying an e-cigarette among smokers, okay? Next. I do not want to substitute one addiction for another, okay? Even though it would enormously help their health to do that because they've been frightened about addiction, okay, which is a stigmatized term and comes with all kinds of negative connotations, okay? So further research was done on this by some excellent researchers looking at the effect of that EU warning label on smoking behavior. And this is the conclusion. Next. Yeah. Our findings suggest that the Tobacco Products Directive nicotine addiction e-cigarette health warning may reduce smokers' willingness to use and likelihood of purchasing an e-cigarette. Okay, there you have it. You have EU regulation that is turning people off switching from a high risk to a low risk substance use behavior. Okay, that's a bad thing. Okay, next. Let's look at tax. Let's look at shaking down consumers in order to disincentivize their smoking or vaping. Next, please. Okay, now, simple economic concepts here. You have to distinguish between alternatives and complements, okay? So coffee and tea are alternatives, cake and biscuits are alternatives, coffee and cake are complements, tea and biscuits are complements, okay? Vaping and smoking are alternatives, okay? They function as economic alternatives. And I want to show you some research that's been done, again in the United States on this, on what happens when you tax the safer products. Next, please. So this is a great piece of work by an American economist, Michael Pesco, and these were his findings. Next. Okay, so this is Congress raises e-cigarettes to a level comparable to cigarette taxes. Now, thankfully, no one's proposing to do that in the European Union, but they were proposing to do it in the United States. This is what the effects were. It would reduce teenage e-cigarette use, but 2 in 3 teens who do not use e-cigarettes would smoke cigarettes instead. Next. And this was being done to protect young people, remember. It would create approximately 500,000 extra teenage smokers overall. This is a vape tax. Next. It would raise the number of daily adult cigarette smokers by 2.5 million nationally. That's out of the US population of smokers of around 30 million. And every e-cigarette pod eliminated would lead to 5.5 extra packs of cigarettes sold instead, okay? Massive substitution effects driven by taxes, okay? Again, the policymakers need to take care that when they think they're doing something positive with e-cigarette taxes, they're not doing something negative because of the effect on smoking. Next. Okay, I'm coming to the end now, but I just want to put youth use in context because everybody goes on about this, and I apologize for this, keep using American data, but it's much more readily available. Next. So in the United States, we had a rapid rise in youth use of vaping, okay? And it rose to 27.5% of high school kids in the past 30 days, okay? So at least once in the past 30 days. Next. And reached a peak of concern in 2019. Next. And that led to what I call a sort of moral panic. And all the American newspapers, health groups, everyone went incredibly negative about vaping, Okay, then what happened? What happened next was, again, was we saw that e-cigarette use fell rapidly in the following years. And my contention is that this was basically a fad. It was a fashion. It got massive amounts of press coverage. Everybody saw it. All the adults hated it. All the kids said, well, that is, of course, something we must do because adults hate it. And what happened is that burnt out very quickly. It was a moral panic. But the problem is, it led to a whole series of legislative actions that have not been reversed. Just like the snus ban in the European Union has not been reversed, so the measures in the United States have not been reversed. Next. Now, the thing that I really want everybody to understand here is that there are really two types of vaping. Infrequent, this youth vaping, infrequent vaping, okay, is far less than daily, you know, maybe less than 20 days a month. That's how they define it. This is mostly kids messing around at parties, trying it, borrowing it from friends. It's not particularly serious. It's frivolous, it's experimental, it's probably transient. It isn't that harmful because vaping isn't that harmful. It's not something we should be that worried about. It's not what we would like, but it's not something that we should be that worried about. And it's certainly not something we should put adults at risk because of. Next. And that's mostly experimental and frivolous. The interesting one is the frequent use. Next. Now, this is more committed. So this is people vaping, young people vaping more than 20 days per month or daily or frequently. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this group is these are the young people who would otherwise have been smoking. And this is the group that always gets forgotten because these are the kids from poor neighborhoods, poorer families, doing less well at school, more likely to be delinquent, more likely to have other substance use behaviors, more likely to have mental health problems and so on. They're the kids who would be smokers. They are vaping instead. For them, the youth vaping is a benefit. And this will be the same in the European Union. This isn't confined to the United States. Okay, so we have a relatively inconsequential behavior, that's the orange, combined with a beneficial youth vaping behavior. And we need to think very carefully about what we do when we do massive interventions to protect youth. First of all, what we do for adults, but also what we do for young people. Next. Okay, so these are the trade-offs. Next. Adults who smoke and adults who use vapes to stop smoking. There are far more of those. There will be at least 15 times as many of them, or maybe 10 to 15 times, depending on the country, as many of them as youth vapers or smokers. They are by far the largest group in the European Union. Next, youth. Youth who would not otherwise use nicotine. Now, they may be vaping instead of using, and that's a harm, but it's not a very serious harm. It's likely to be transient. The hidden group would be, next, the youth who would otherwise be smoking. Almost no one talks about them, and yet they are the important youth group from point of view of risk. Next. So I'm going to finish now with what I think is the right policy approach, risk proportionate policy. Okay, next. And that means you do the strongest policy measures for the combustible products. They're the ones that are most dangerous. They're the ones that you're trying to stop. So high taxes, advertising bans, graphic warnings, no smoking in public places, plain packaging, control over reward-enhancing additives, no sales to under 21, ban the flavours. The EU's already done that for cigarettes, menthol and all the other flavours, and set products to control risks and reduce appeal. That's a program for dealing with smoking, okay? And it's tough. It's the hardest regulation you can come up consistent with acceptance by the European publics and political bodies, okay? It's not a ban, but it's what you can do to deal with smoking. On the vaping, heated tobacco and oral nicotine and snus, well, first of all, lift the ban on snus. Absolutely ridiculous. That is an absurdity. But you have low levels of tax. You don't prohibit advertising, you control themes and placement. Warnings, you don't have off-putting warnings, you encourage With risk communications, you encourage switching. You don't have plain packaging, but you might want to control marketing themes. Ingredients, you blacklist things that are hazardous, but you're not doing it to control the use and appeal. Age restrictions, no sales to under 18, because you want young people who smoke to be able to switch. On flavours, you don't ban flavours, but you might control descriptors because they're a form of marketing. So you just say, okay, you can have mango, but you don't necessarily call it Tutti Frutti Mango Explosion for kids. You allow fruit, but you don't have Call of Fruity as a brand name or something like that. So it's about controlling the marketing proposition, not the actual flavour itself. And then with product standards, you're just trying to control risks. So mechanical, thermal, electrical, and chemical risks, and making those acceptable, consistent with the products still being acceptable replacements for smoking. Next. So that's it. Those are my sort of like thoughts on the pitfalls of policy making here and the struggle with unintended consequences and trade-offs. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much for this second presentation. Now we're going to have some Q&As. If it's any questions from the audience, just push the button and the red one.
How? En español. Esta pregunta es para.
This is a question for Julio. You said the users are concerned, or we're concerned generally about flavors, online sales, online education. What are the proposals that come from users in order to regulate this, in order to be able to protect young people when it comes to these kinds of topics? Well, when it comes to online sales, that's quite easy. It's just a case of controlling the purchase, and there are lots of mechanisms or systems for stores to be able to check age and restrict sales to minors. And also, when it comes to couriers who hand over packages, they already do this with other kinds of packages. You can request some kind of ID from the person who's receiving the package. So it's actually quite easy to check that only adults are able to access those products. I agree with what Clive said about labelling as well. And having some kind of regulation on labelling would be a good idea. But banning flavours, as we've already discussed, is one of the biggest mistakes that could be made here. When it comes to social media, I think we've also seen there an example of how the sector has self-regulated. Because, for example, on YouTube, that's already regulated by YouTube itself. My videos, for example, can only be accessed by adults. You have to register, you have to have a verified account in order to see those videos, and once you've created the account, you can watch the videos. But a minor, for example, can't watch the videos. That's obviously not the case in all social media platforms, but I'm sure others will come to apply similar methods. But yeah, I think regulation is actually quite straightforward.
Is it any other question? Yep.
Hi there. I have a question for the consumers primarily. I'd just like to ask, from your own experience and from the experiences of the people that you represent, what do you think it is about e-cigarettes that make them so popular and successful as a smoking cessation aid? Any of you?
Anyone who wants to answer the question?
Click this thing. Oh, yeah. From my experience, it was the ability to tailor the experience. I mean, when I started, it was 24 milligram nicotine. I'm now using 6. I could drop that as I went on. The ability to change flavours, because you won't always fancy, I don't know, blueberry shortcake or whatever. The other thing is, it's an opt-in. You choose to buy the product. You're making the decision. And after 2 or 3 weeks of successfully not smoking, that is hugely empowering for people who have struggled up to then. It becomes a snowballing effect. It gets easier and easier. They need to be advertised. They need to have flavours. I would suggest maybe we could pressurise the tobacco companies to put card inserts in the packets of cigarettes saying switch to our e-cigarette product or whatever. Maybe we could have the branding on the ashtrays in the smoking area. For mail order, that's one thing that should never be in plain packaging. If somebody is posting that, it should be clearly marked what the contents are. That way, if an underage person has ordered it and it arrives in the house, that envelope will be there as a warning to the parents. That's a very simple managing thing. All these problems are very solvable just by thinking about what the user wants and what the non-user doesn't need. We tend to focus on preventing non-users taking it up rather than encouraging smokers to take it up. We have a very protective attitude to non-smokers. That's all I have to offer.
Okay, I can. Je pense que
I think that the success comes from the smoker's awareness about the dangers of smoking, and that awareness has risen over the 21st century. And the anti-tobacco fight has been a good thing, and that's helped to change people's minds and raise awareness about the risks of smoking. At the moment, the fight against tobacco has taken a strange turn. Vaping and snus in Sweden, which has progressively changed the smoking profile in Sweden in the 90s and 2000s, and vaping that came out in the early 2010s in the rest of the world. That allows people to consume nicotine, which is not something that we necessarily need to get rid of forever, ban forever, because it does respond to certain needs or desires. In my presentation, I said that I had health problems. I have circulation, I have joint problems, and nicotine helps me relax. And when I stopped smoking, I had cramps, which made my joints even tenser, and they were already difficult. So that kind of thing. There's also a mood issue. It helps you balance your mood. So there are two things. It's a bit of a stimulant, and it's also a sedative. I wouldn't advise people to consume nicotine, but for some people it can be beneficial. So if we can use it without the risks linked to it, without the risk linked to smoking, then by reproducing the upside of smoking, because sometimes people forget, why are there so many smokers? Well, cigarettes are very effective in terms of administering nicotine. You get the hit within seconds in the blood, in the brain, and you get synapses firing, neuroreceptors are quite happy at what they get. And you can see that with the consumption of other psychoactive substances. That smoking is a very effective way of delivering that, but it destroys your lungs, it's carcinogenic. So if you can get a product that's as effective and gives the same amount of pleasure and reduces the health risks, then that will be a solution for 25% of smokers in Europe. So I think vaping has been very successful since 2010, 14. And I hope I've responded to your question, Mr. Sweeney.
Yes, hello. I have a question regarding vaping. You have all mentioned that flavors are extremely important for adult smokers to switch. How do you think the EP and the member states should deal with flavors? I don't know if it's a question for Mr. Bates or if anyone else would like to answer. Thank you.
Okay. There's really three ways of thinking of a flavour. The first is a chemical recipe, so it's a mixture of chemicals and ingredients that go in. The second is a sensory experience like apple or mango or cheesecake. And then the third is a flavour descriptor, so what's written about it on the side of the packet and how it's described, okay? On the first of those, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that you shouldn't have ingredients in the flavours that are, excessively harmful to health at the concentrations at which they're used. So you would take out carcinogens, respiratory sensitizers, and so on. And that's just a pure safety thing. That would be part of any normal consumer protection regulation and regime. Obviously, we don't want dangerous substances in the products that people are using. The second is the sensory experience. I don't think the EU should intervene on that at all with vaping, because I think, as everyone has said, that's integral to the experience. Okay? And if you do that, people will mix their own, or they will buy via illicit trade, or they will import, or they will get what they want somehow. And we will end up with an unregulated flavours market where there may be risks associated with the other two. The third category, descriptors, is a form of marketing, and the logic is to control that marketing in the same way that you would control advertising or sponsorship or promotion. So you would have principles that say that you mustn't, like we see in the Tobacco Products Directive, that you mustn't imply that this improves sporting prowess, or it will make you more successful in love and life, or it will, it will, or do things that are obviously appealing to children, using cartoon characters and some. And I'm sorry to say, there are some irresponsible actors in the vaping industry who do that. Now, they tend to get a lot of publicity by the opponents of vaping, but they tend to be very tiny in amount of products that they sell. But nevertheless, they create a reputational impact. They aren't what most people are using. So I would clean all that side of it up. So I'd have safe liquids and I would have responsible marketing, but I would not have any bans on the sensory experiences, the names, those flavors that I put up, the fruit, the candy, the tobacco, the menthol, the chalk, the pastry, all of that. You leave that because that is integral. And it's just the same way. I always think of it a bit like pizzas. If pizza parlors only sold margarita pizzas, okay, yeah, margarita pizza, very nice. Not everybody's cup of tea, but you wouldn't have so many pizzas consumed in Brussels if that's all they sold.
Someone else want to answer that question as well, or is it more, you have follow-up questions?
Yeah, a following up question. What would you say is the main problem with the TPD and how could it be improved?
So There are like a list of problems. Let's start with the snus ban. That is ridiculous. It's a much safer product, and beyond any reasonable doubt, it's been extremely beneficial for health, or snus has been extremely beneficial for health in Sweden, in Norway, to some extent in Finland. That ban should be lifted, has no place in any EU internal market directive, which is what the Tobacco Products Directive is. The bans on advertising are excessive because you really want the low-risk alternatives to be advertised so that they can compete with the high-risk incumbents. So essentially the advertising restrictions are anti-innovation. They create a barrier to innovation. So you would want to restrict themes and placement, but you wouldn't want outright bans on advertising that are in the Tobacco Products Directive. I think, as others have mentioned, the limit on nicotine strengths, whilst it doesn't affect most vapers, and most people, certainly most people have been vaping for some time, it has some adverse effects in that it makes it harder for the most dependent smokers to make an initial switch. And it also works against very compact and convenient devices like the Juul products, which rely on having high-strength liquids used in small volumes with low energy, smaller batteries, and so on. So those limits don't achieve anything, but they are barriers to innovation and better products. The warnings form a deterrent to use, but they don't form useful risk communications that apply, that encourage smokers to switch from high risk to low risk measures. People have suggested there should be inserts in cigarette packs. I would love that. I think that would be very cool if they could get people to encourage people to make a switch and be confident in switching from high risk to low risk products. The limits on container sizes, 10 millilitres for containers, 2 millilitres for tanks. There's absolutely nothing achieved by those. They are counterproductive. They have negative effects. They should go. That should be a matter of the design of manufacturers and innovators to meet the demand in the marketplace. There's no reason to do it. So those would be some of the things that I find, I think also cross-border and internet sales, they should be regulated. They shouldn't be banned for the safer products, but they should be regulated so there's proper control over age identification, use of credit cards, and so on. So I don't know if anyone else wants to pick up any other points, but that's quite a long list of things that could be improved, but probably won't be when they come to do the next round of the Tobacco Products Directive.
Effectivement, c'est une longue.
Well, yes, it's a long list of problems with the TBD being the root of the problem because it was badly designed in terms of dealing with a risk reduction strategy. But I just wanted to repeat this because this is something that came out in our survey as a request. The limit of 10 millilitres of content of the liquid vials is pointless. I haven't found a reason to justify that. And that means that there's a lot of plastic waste and production costs are borne by the consumers, and that makes the prices 30 to 50% higher with no reason for that, and that's something that we could easily change. So just to point that out. And Clive went over everything else, the various problems.
I think that was the last questions. Thank you all for participating. It has been very interesting, and I hope actually EU can take some, learn something from this to actually do something against the smoking.